Hello, and thank you for joining us for the latest talk in the Australian War Memorial's History Webinar series. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting this morning. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. My name is Megan Adams, and I'm a historian here at the Australian War Memorial. Today, we will be hearing from Dr Peter Yule. Peter has a PhD in history from the University of Melbourne, where he is a research fellow in the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies. He has written over 25 books on Australian military, economic and medical history, including histories of the Collins-class submarine project, Australian National Airways, the Australian economy in the First World War, and the Melbourne's Royal Children's Hospital. In 2016, he was commissioned by the Australian War Memorial to lead a 4-year research project, A History of the Medical Legacies of the Vietnam War, resulting in the publication of The Long Shadow, Australian Vietnam Veterans Since the War in 2020. It is this topic that we will be hearing about today. I will now pass over to you, Peter.
Yes, as Megan said, in 2016 I was commissioned by the War Memorial to write a history of the medical legacies of the Vietnam War. Essentially, this means about what has happened to Vietnam War veterans since they came home from the war. This was a really unusual thing to do. Historians have always been interested in wars, but there has been little interest in the long-term impact of wars on those who fought in them. For example, there are literally thousands of books about, say, the Napoleonic Wars, about the strategy, tactics, battles, weapons, even uniforms, but only a handful of articles even discuss briefly the physical and mental health of veterans of those wars. So why did the Memorial ask me to research and write about the health of Vietnam veterans? Well, the main reason is that the health effects of the Vietnam War have been, at least in Australia and America, the major issue arising from the war since the late 1970s. They've been the subject of hundreds of medical studies. They led to the acceptance of a new psychiatric disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. They've been the subject of political controversy and any number of major inquiries, including the Agent Orange Royal Commission in the 1980s. So why is this so? Have the medical legacies of the Vietnam War been greater than other wars? Or are they different due to Agent Orange or other factors? Or have the veterans simply been more vocal? I was grateful that the Memorial gave the project sufficient resources to interview many veterans all around Australia and also to employ an epidemiologist to help interpret the statistics presented in all the hundreds of studies of veterans. So, what conclusions did I come to from my research? A useful starting point for understanding the health impacts of the Vietnam War is the events of April 1975 in Vietnam. By 1975, most Australians had put the Vietnam War into the back of their memories. The fall of Saigon and the collapse of the South Vietnamese regime were largely ignored by the public. But to many Vietnam veterans, the pictures of a North Vietnamese tank crashing through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon came as a crushing blow. This image alone made it brutally obvious that the deaths of 521 Australians, the wounding of thousands more, the sacrifices of 60,000 servicemen and women had all been in vain. One veteran expressed the feelings of many. He said, "I don't think any Australian soldier who served in Vietnam was at all surprised to see the television pictures in 1975 of the fall of Saigon. It was bound to happen, and somehow we all knew it would happen someday. Every day we were there in Vietnam, we saw the seeds of defeat sown in the way the war was waged." While I wasn't surprised to see the pictures, I was surprised that 7 years later I was so affected by it. I felt choked up. What was it all for? All the heartache, all the bloodshed, all the young lives damaged or destroyed, the hatred, the bitterness, the maiming, the mistakes, the muddles, the murders. It seemed so pointless and futile. In any organisation, the most important means of inspiring and galvanising its members is to have a purpose that is clear, easily articulated and widely shared. There is a story, and I'm not sure whether it's true or not, but it's a good story, about President Kennedy visiting a NASA facility soon after the announcement of the plan to land a man on the moon by 1970. The President stopped to speak to a janitor who was carrying a mop and bucket and asked the man what he did, to which the reply came, "I'm helping put a man on the moon." This unifying sense of purpose helped NASA achieve what many believed to be impossible. And I think you can see the same sort of sense of purpose in the Ukrainian resistance to Russian aggression over the last 12 months. The purpose that is driving the Ukrainians is obviously front and centre for them. Yet the Australians in Vietnam never had a clear sense of purpose. All the way with LBJ was a slogan, not a purpose worth risking one's life for. Some Australians went to Vietnam accepting the domino theory that they were going to stop the downward thrust of communism, but many had no idea why they were going. Only a few had doubts about the war before they went to Vietnam, but many more came to question why they were there, when they found that many of the people they thought they were there to protect regarded them with suspicion and hatred. Unlike the Americans, whose morale collapsed in the later years of the war, the Australians kept fighting to the finish. They endured the trauma, tragedy and deprivations of the war, driven by loyalty to their mates and a strong commitment to professionalism, favourably comparing their skills and performance against the Americans. Australians in Vietnam were also unified by their pervasive sense of betrayal. There was almost universal loathing of anti-war protesters and of the government that had sent them to Vietnam without a clear purpose. One soldier summarised the feelings of many Australians in Vietnam, particularly in the later stages of the war, when he wrote to his wife, "If our political leaders won't support us, if our own media aren't willing to understand us, and if our own communities don't want to know us, then what the hell are we here for? My tour has almost come to an end and I feel it has been such a waste." In the Second World War, Australians shared a strong sense of purpose. They were united in defence of their country and their determination to defeat evil regimes. The home front was fully mobilised in support of the war, and slogans like "We're doing our share for the boys over there" had real meaning. Rationing, blackouts and air raid shelters gave a sense that the civilian population was sharing some of the privations of the fighting forces. In stark contrast, Australians in Vietnam felt ignored, rejected or reviled by Australians at home. The servicemen and women in Vietnam sacrificed their lives, their health and their youth on behalf of a population at home that either didn't care or actively opposed their actions. Camaraderie and mateship helped see the Australians through the war, but after the war these very characteristics magnified the trauma of the homecoming. With one-year tours, veterans arrived home in small numbers spread over a decade. Most national servicemen were quickly discharged, while regulars were dispersed to different units. The separation from their mates was abrupt and traumatic. When servicemen and women returned after the First and Second World Wars, they were welcomed home enthusiastically. The situation was completely different for Vietnam veterans. Many veterans felt that they were personally blamed for the war. Even the RSL failed to welcome them, with some sub-branches openly excluding them on the grounds that Vietnam had not been a real war, just a police action. It is no wonder that many Vietnam veterans felt their service and sacrifice were not recognised by the community they thought they had been fighting for. Many never revealed that they were veterans or talked about the war. Throughout the 1970s, what one veteran eloquently called the decade of silence, they were isolated from their mates, rarely noticed and ignored by DVA and the government. It has often been argued that Vietnam was no different from earlier wars and that the problems of its veterans are the same as those of earlier wars. I don't agree with that contention. Vietnam was different in many ways. The nature of a guerrilla war with its constant threat of danger, the intensity of operations, the widespread use of chemicals, the lack of purpose, the homecoming and the final defeat all differentiated Vietnam radically from Australia's earlier wars. These factors led to the medical legacies of the Vietnam War being substantially different to those of earlier wars in which Australians had fought. In the late 1970s, the health of Vietnam veterans emerged as a political issue with the beginnings of the Agent Orange controversy and the acceptance of PTSD as a psychiatric diagnosis. Vietnam veterans organisations were formed in the United States and in Australia, and governments were forced to respond to their concerns. From this time onwards, there were two competing narratives around veterans' health. The official narrative of the government and DVA that focused very narrowly on Agent Orange arguing that few veterans had been exposed and the health consequences were minimal, and the veterans narrative that took a much broader view of veterans' health, and on Agent Orange held that exposure was near universal and the health consequences were devastating. The government and veterans agreed that studies were needed to establish the extent and causes of veterans' ill health, but in retrospect their ideas on how the studies should be carried out were extremely naive. In 1980, the Fraser government set up an ambitious and expensive epidemiological study of all Vietnam veterans, but this was abandoned when it proved impossible to construct an exposure index or even develop a satisfactory study protocol. For their part, the veterans called for a judicial inquiry into Agent Orange, but when the Hawke Labor government agreed to do this in 1983, the resulting Evatt Royal Commission was a disappointment for the veterans. At that time, there were no epidemiological studies that linked veterans' ill health to exposure to herbicides, and the Royal Commission did not accept the veterans' anecdotal accounts of frequent exposure to herbicides and resulting ill health, when the existing scientific studies showed little evidence of exposure or of harm. The failure of major epidemiological studies in Australia and in America, and the findings of the Evatt Royal Commission, did not end the controversy over the health of Vietnam veterans. The successful advocacy of the veterans' organisations made it impossible for governments to ignore the reality of the declining physical and mental health of many veterans. Consequently, over the last 40 years, a continual stream of studies has been carried out, making Vietnam veterans probably the most studied large cohort in human history. The net result of the studies is a lesson in the limits of epidemiology. Although there is no doubt that the mental and physical health of Vietnam veterans is worse than that of non-veterans of the same age, the studies are erratic and contradictory in their results, showing greatly varying patterns of disease and no consistent patterns of causation beyond service in Vietnam. The most coherent epidemiological results have been on veterans' mental health. All studies agree that Vietnam veterans have experienced a higher level of mental health problems than non-veterans of the same age. But even here there are anomalies. The focus of studies of veterans' mental health has always been on PTSD, and very little attention has been given to other mental disorders. This tendency began in the 1970s when psychiatrists developed PTSD as a diagnosis to explain the symptoms they saw in many Vietnam veterans. Ever since PTSD was formally defined in 1980, it has been regarded by the public and by many researchers as the only mental health problem of Vietnam veterans. The belief is that if a veteran has a mental health problem, it must be PTSD. And this view has pervaded DVA, and veterans believe they are far more likely to succeed with a claim for PTSD than for any other mental health condition. Yet studies have consistently found that Australian Vietnam veterans suffer from a wide range of mental health disorders, with anxiety, depression and alcohol-related disorders possibly being as prevalent as PTSD. War has a lifelong impact on those who fight, and it is now realised that veterans become increasingly vulnerable to mental health problems as they age. The possibility of late-onset PTSD was originally questioned by many psychiatrists, but several studies have confirmed that it frequently occurs. The incidence of PTSD and other mental illnesses is increasing among Vietnam veterans. Further, many other mental and physical problems of old age, including dementia, are now known to be more common among war veterans. Early studies of the mental health of Vietnam veterans focused solely on the veterans themselves, but from the 1990s, studies began to look at the impact that living with a veteran could have on their partners and their children. Family studies have shown that many veterans' families were dysfunctional, and a high proportion of wives and children have experienced mental health issues as a result. Yet veterans' families have not experienced a higher level of family breakdown than non-veterans' families, and one of the strongest themes that emerged from the family studies, and also supported by the interview program undertaken for this project, has been the dedicated role played by many partners of Vietnam veterans in caring for veterans and holding their families together. Until the 1990s, the results of studies of the physical health of Vietnam veterans were complicated by the healthy soldier effect, that is, the high levels of fitness acquired in military training and war service, which carry over for many years into civilian life. Despite the belief of the founders of the the Vietnam Veterans Association that their fellow veterans were suffering far worse health than non-veterans, early studies all showed that Vietnam veterans were in fact substantially healthier. This is in the 1970s and early 1980s. However, as the healthy soldier effect has faded, veterans' health relative to the rest of the community has worsened. Mortality rates are higher, and the incidence of many diseases has increased more rapidly for Vietnam veterans than for non-veterans of the same age. Since 2000, almost all studies of cancer incidence and mortality among Vietnam veterans have shown an elevated level of cancer compared to the general population, generally between 6 and 15%. Yet the findings on the incidence and mortality from different cancers varied greatly between studies. The most consistent findings were that Vietnam veterans have a greater incidence of lung cancer, head and neck cancer, melanoma and prostate cancer than non-veterans, but for other cancers the results were erratic. The fact that Vietnam veterans experience worse physical health than non-veterans of the same age is not debated, but the cause or causes of their relative ill health is still highly controversial. The supporters of the official narrative of veterans' ill health have always tended to blame post-war lifestyle factors such as high rates of alcohol abuse and smoking, along with poor diet and exercise. They also concede there is a strong link between mental health problems and poor physical health, often due to self-medication with alcohol. While not denying that these factors have contributed to veterans' poor health, activist veterans have long argued that many veterans' illnesses, particularly cancer, as well as birth defects in veterans' children, are the result of exposure to the herbicide Agent Orange in Vietnam. The epidemiological evidence linking veterans' ill health to herbicide exposure is inconsistent. Most researchers focus on the effect of exposure to dioxin, a contaminant found in 2,4,5-T, one of the constituents of Agent Orange. Studies of workers in chemical factories, herbicide sprayers, and civilians exposed in industrial accidents, such as that in Seveso, Italy in 1976, have suggested a probable link between exposure to high levels of dioxin and increased incidence of some cancers, heart disease, and some other diseases. However, even with extremely high levels of exposure, the increased incidence of disease is relatively small. Further, there has been no consistent pattern of diseases between different groups and different studies. Similarly, long-term studies of the Americans who sprayed herbicides in Vietnam, the ranch hand cohort, one of the few groups of veterans with unquestioned high exposure to herbicides, have found little evidence of widespread ill health, although they do suffer from a slightly higher level of some diseases, including diabetes, melanoma, and prostate cancer. Concerns about the health impacts of Agent Orange began in the late 1960s, when animal tests showed that high levels of maternal exposure to dioxin could cause birth defects. That's maternal exposure. Although animal tests did not show an increased incidence of birth defects through paternal exposure, many male veterans have long believed that their children and grandchildren have a high level of birth defects. There have been numerous epidemiological studies designed to assess the extent of birth defects among veterans' children, and most have found no evidence of increased birth defects. The only studies that have found a significantly higher level of birth defects have been studies of children born in Vietnam, where in most cases the mother would have been exposed, and a study of veterans' children in Tasmania, whose methodology was questionable and whose results have never been replicated. The Agent Orange controversy has always revolved around two issues. Were veterans exposed to Agent Orange? And if they were, did it cause ill effects? Epidemiological studies of highly exposed groups indicate that exposure to high levels of dioxin certainly causes adverse health effects. However, it has proved impossible to establish the extent to which service personnel in Vietnam were exposed. The early belief that it would be possible to construct an exposure index able to categorise all veterans proved fanciful, and tests to determine the level of dioxin in the body were not developed until the 1980s. Tests on groups known to have been highly exposed, such as the ranch handers, showed elevated dioxin levels many years after the war, but logistics and expense meant that larger samples of veterans were never tested. As a result, the levels of exposure of Australian Vietnam veterans to Agent Orange remains unknown. Supporters of the official narrative have always argued that exposure was minimal, but veterans who saw the jungle dying or were saturated with spray cannot accept this. Political pressure from veterans has forced governments in Australia and America to accept the position that service in Vietnam equated to exposure to Agent Orange. The reality is that epidemiological studies rarely produce unequivocal results or provide a clear guide to public policy. The effects of a single chemical are very difficult to measure and are often impossible to distinguish from other factors. Epidemiological studies show a clear link between service in Vietnam and increased incidence of many health problems. Many veterans, and probably most members of the public, believe that exposure to Agent Orange is the main reason. Although there has been a vast amount of research on the effect of Agent Orange, the results are far from conclusive. Because of the emphasis on Agent Orange, little is known of the long-term effects of exposure to the many other toxic agents such as pesticides, anti-malarial drugs, fuel vapours and tropical parasites to which service personnel in Vietnam were exposed. In particular, the possible health effects of exposure to insecticide are still largely unknown, even though all Australians in Vietnam were continually exposed to large quantities of insecticides, which were sprayed around bases with no safety precautions at all. And the concentration on Agent Orange makes it easy to forget that thousands of veterans are suffering the long-term effect of battle wounds and accidents. In 2018, official DVA figures showed that 47,000 Vietnam veterans had a disability accepted for compensation. The total number of accepted conditions was almost 200,000, meaning that on average each veteran had over 4 accepted disabilities arising out of their war service. About 13,000 Vietnam veterans have died since the war, so the DVA figures show that almost every surviving veteran suffers at least one war-caused disability, and most have multiple disabilities. Anecdotal evidence from veterans suggests that many have further disabilities that they believe are war-caused but have not been accepted for compensation. The official cost to Australia of the Vietnam War between 1962 and March 1972 was $218 million. At today's prices, that would be about $3 billion. The cost of caring for those who served in the war is already many times more than the cost of fighting the war, and it will continue for many years to come. In the financial year 2017-18 alone, the cost of disability pensions and medical treatment for Vietnam veterans came to about $2 billion. The total cost of the Vietnam War to Australia will end up being well over $100 billion. The monetary cost of looking after veterans and their families is measurable. The cost in human suffering can't be measured, but is nonetheless real. The anguish of the bereaved, the daily pain and challenges facing those with war-caused disabilities, the trauma of the mentally ill and the impact on their families are legacies of the war that have lasted for decades and will continue for many more. The dollar cost of the war cannot account for the human lives cut short or the lost potential of those killed or maimed. Australia's repatriation system was designed to be generous. I actually have a personal knowledge of this because my great-grandfather was largely responsible for drafting the original repatriation legislation during the First World War. This has always been the intention of Parliament, prompted by the near universal support of the Australian people for the view that those who are sent to fight in their name should be cared for on their return. The generous intent has sometimes been lost in the maze of government bureaucracy or ignored by those concerned at the cost of generosity. But if we cannot afford to be generous to servicemen and women who return damaged by war, then I believe it is utterly wrong to send them to fight in civil wars in distant lands when there is no direct threat to Australia. The experience of Vietnam shows that a majority of soldiers return home from war permanently damaged. The cost of caring for them must be factored into politicians' calculations when they make the decision to go to war. Our armed forces were sent to Vietnam with the flimsiest of justifications, and early public support evaporated as the government's case for the war collapsed. Our servicemen and women performed their duty professionally and skillfully under enormous difficulties, despite the dubious legitimacy of the cause they were fighting for and the dwindling support for the war in Australia. They returned home to a nation that ignored their service, a government that abandoned them, and a noisy minority who blamed them for doing what the government had required of them. For many Vietnam veterans, the rejection of their service has played as great a role as the trauma of war in their subsequent mental health problems. Soon after I began work on this project, I arranged to meet 4 Vietnam veterans in a cafe. They're all former infantrymen with severe PTSD. We walked in together, and they were almost fighting with each other to sit in one particular seat, The ones who missed it seemed very uneasy all the time during our chat. It took me a while to realise that the seat that they wanted was the one with its back to the wall and a clear view of the door. Another veteran told me that he and a mate were talking about their time in Vietnam, and his wife told them to get over it, Vietnam was a long time ago. To which his mate said very seriously, Vietnam will never be a long time ago. Thank you very much.
Peter, thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's certainly a very interesting look into the whole Vietnam Medical Legacies project and indeed into the post-war experiences of our veterans. I have a few questions that have come up out of your presentation. So, do you think that Vietnam was much different to other wars that Australians have fought in from a perspective of the mental health outcomes for our veterans?
Look, I do. It's interesting. Clearly, from the First World War, there's enormous discussion in the 1920s and 30s about those who were affected by shell shock, and
Sure.
the conditions on the front line of the First World War were so horrific that it was almost impossible to come through that without severe mental health problems, although a remarkable number seemed to get on with their lives very successfully when they got home. And similarly, the Second World War, in which the fighting for most of our soldiers was not nearly as intense, the long-term effects seem to have been less. The crucial difference to me with the First and Second World War is that there was no questioning of the purpose of the war. There was no arguments about whether or not we should be there. I mean, towards the end of the First World War, there was some questioning, of course, but for those who joined up early in the war, they absolutely convinced that they were on the right side, that they were the goodies, and crucially, in both the First and Second World Wars, they won. Whereas in Vietnam, they came to question why they were there, and then, as I say, with the events of April 1975, when they realised, the war had been lost, it had all been totally useless. I think that was a crushing blow to many of them. So I think that's played a very important part in the different mental health outcomes. One interesting thing with Vietnam is the incidence of PTSD doesn't seem to vary greatly between those who were actually frontline soldiers and those who were more based at back at the bases and didn't see intense fighting. And I do think that's got a lot to do with the reception they got when they returned home, which obviously was the same for all the soldiers, that they all felt rejected and reviled. They all shared the stigma of having fought in a war that was lost.
And so another question that raises in terms of the way that they were treated when they came home, do you think that there was much difference between Nashos who served and the regulars who served in terms of coming home and returning to society?
Yeah, look, that's a really interesting question. It's something that we looked for in the research very closely, because the actual experience of coming home was very different. The Nashos were almost all discharged almost immediately and went back to civilian life as individuals, completely lost touch with their mates. Whereas the regulars, often they were sent to different units, but they still remained within the army structure and with people who, in many cases, with people who'd been to Vietnam, if not necessarily with them, who understood what they were doing. And yet the long-term mental health effects are remarkably similar. In some ways, I think the incidence of PTSD amongst former regulars is slightly higher than for former Nashos. So perhaps a quick return to civilian life was the answer rather than staying in the army. But so the long-term effects haven't been as different as you'd expect from the different experience they had of homecoming.
Right.
We were rather surprised at that finding.
Absolutely. You must have had lots of different things throughout the study that really surprised you, in terms of what you found out about the veterans. And something else that has obviously prevailed with conversations around medical legacies of Vietnam is Agent Orange, which you mentioned quite a bit in your talk. So a lot of veterans have claimed that they were regularly sprayed with Agent Orange. How can you speak to that? What's your sort of view on that?
Look, there's absolutely no doubt that some veterans were sprayed with Agent Orange, because the Americans were spraying it, not exactly haphazardly, and certainly every mission was charted as where it was meant to fly. Whether it actually flew there, and to what extent the spray drifted on the wind is something really hard to imagine. That being said, there's no doubt at all that some veterans have confused spraying with insecticide with spraying with Agent Orange, because the bases were regularly sprayed with insecticide from the air, and and that was done with the same aircraft that sprayed, not the actual, the same type of aircraft that sprayed Agent Orange. The difference was that the ones that sprayed insecticide weren't camouflaged, because the Viet Cong, they also appreciated the insecticide being sprayed to keep down the mosquitoes, because it reduced malaria for them as well as for us. So they tended not to shoot at the insecticide spraying planes, whereas the ones spraying Agent Orange were camouflaged. And so that was the difference. But the ones spraying the bases were spraying insecticide, not Agent Orange. That is something that some veterans have become confused about.
Absolutely. Yeah, very interesting. Certainly a lot to consider with the medical legacies of the Vietnam War. So we really, really appreciate your time today, Peter. Thank you very much.
You're very
And
welcome.
thank you to those at home for tuning in. Our next webinar will be in October 2023, when we will speak to one of the Memorial's senior historians, Craig Tibbetts. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.